This is Robert Stark. I'm joined here with Greg Johnson. We're going to be discussing topics relating to the alt-left. Greg, great having you on. I haven't talked to you in a while.
Yeah, it's great to be back. I've done a lot of interviews over the years with you now, Robert. I'm glad you're still in the game.
And I'm also joined here with my co-host, Pilleater.
Hi, Greg. It's nice talking to you. I'm quite a fan, and I actually read Countercurrents every day, so it's really a privilege to talk to you too.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to meet you.
So on this topic of an alt-left, Greg, I know you did a alt-left roundtable with the Rabbit, who's a regular on this show, and I think it was also Millennial Woes. Can you talk about that roundtable and some of the things you discussed in regards to the alt-left? And are you generally sympathetic to the idea?
Well, I'm generally sympathetic to an idea of an alt everything, I guess. But the idea of an alt-left, I mean, what does that mean? To me, that, I guess, means a race realist left, right? And when I wrote my article years ago, West Coast White Nationalism, in a way, that was a description of a kind of alt-left, or a position that I think is as far to the left as one can reasonably go. And the ways in which it is not left, though, is that it's not egalitarian. It believes in human biodiversity, and it believes that there's no moral obligation to equalize what's unequal. So it's left, though, in the sense that it embraces a lot of things that are embraced by leftists, sort of the cultural left, that are not necessarily connected with egalitarianism anyway. So a lot of leftists are environmentalists, they're Greens, they're into historic preservation, they like communities that you can walk in, they are opposed to certain ugly forms of commercial development, they're trying to preserve private life and public spaces from encroachment by private enterprise. And all of those things, I think, are admirable and really in keeping with traditional European mores and political institutions that are just pre-modern. So that's how I see the alt-left or West Coast white nationalism, as a non-egalitarian race realist outlook that embraces a lot of things that happen to be embraced by the left, that basically takes the Tolkien Hobbit parts out of the new left and drops a lot of the Marcuse and feminist type stuff out of the left, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, on a recent interview, or I think it might have been Red Ice, you were talking about how the left should be marginalized as possible, and that there's some negative values being taught, especially like with the whole rampant feminism and things about transgender. It's unhealthy, and to me it's very important to describe a left wing, like you said, that is very race realist. But what things in an alt left would be marginalized, or what would be more propagated to be like a healthy normative thing?
Well, when I talk about marginalizing the left, I really mean that the existing left, which is anti-white, anti-male, basically nihilism on steroids, but that's the only time they'd ever use steroids, and just biologically decadent and railing against anything that's healthy and vital. That kind of left, I think, needs to be marginalized. However, like I said, there are political opinions and lifestyle options and things like that that are associated with the political left that are not necessarily against nature. I mean, the whole environmentalist movement is pro-nature. It's just that when you get to the human realm, suddenly they throw all that out and have this idea that somehow, they love to talk about evolution, and then they exempt the human mind, right? Everything becomes historical and mutable and conventional when it comes to human differences. And that kind of stuff has to be ejected. But there's the healthy, naturalistic granola left that I think, if it can be divorced from the crusading feminist, Marxist, anti-white left, is perfectly healthy, normal, traditional, and European.
Oh yeah.
So that's what I want to keep.
The demographics of this alt-left and the kind of demographics of your article, West Coast White Nationalism, you talk about people you've met, and this is kind of like a precursor to the alt-left. Do you see more people coming from who have long time identified as being on the left, or do you see trying to bring over people from maybe with more right-wing ideas to the left, like let's say there's one hand you have kind of like Swipple people, and they're into things like environmentalism, historic preservation, and maybe they're not like into political correctness, cultural Marxism, but at the same time they don't want to. They're maybe iffy about getting closer towards like the kind of views you talk about.
Right.
Then on the other end you have like people like who follow Breitbart, and they're maybe like they're nationalistic kind of Trump supporters, racially aware to some degree, but are into a lot of like mainstream conservative stuff, like kind of fetishizing like capitalism and suburbia. Out of those two groups, which one do you think you have a better chance of reaching out to?
Well, I think we have a good chance of reaching out to both. And we have to reach out to both. We have to reach out to everyone. And in this essay that I wrote a few years back called Hegemony, I describe the goal of metapolitics as I understand it, which is to really break down the anti-white consensus that exists throughout the culture, even on the right in America. There's sort of an anti-white or anti-racist consensus in place that functions as an anti-white consensus, even though a lot of people like the Paul Ryans would never admit to themselves would never think of themselves as anti-white, but by being anti-racist, they're effectively only against white racism, and therefore it is de facto anti-white. But we have this anti-white consensus, this anti-white hegemony in our society, and we need to break that down and replace it with a pro-white hegemony. And that hegemony really would extend to all the different realms of culture and all the full political spectrum, the full spectrum of political options. So when Rabbit wrote the alt-left piece, I thought, great, here's the guy who wants to identify as left, and yet on essential issues connected with race realism, he's on the same page as me. That is the beginning of our hegemony, right? We want to have pro-white ideas hegemonic and then leave the full plurality of institutions and subcultures and political options intact. We just want to make sure that it's all safe for us. And that's what I want to do. I want to make our ideas mainstream and anything anti-white marginal. And that means that there will be a left and a right in a white nationalist society as I envision it. And we'll be arguing about a lot of the same stuff. It's just that white interests will be sacrosanct. That's what we need. Right now we have Jewish interests sacrosanct and anti-white or non-white interests sacrosanct. I want white interests to be sacrosanct in the future. And then everything else can be up for debate. And there will be the seesawing of multiple parties, and things will swing to the left and the right, as there is in the present system. Now, the people, but I do notice that there are people coming to us from the left. I got contacted by a guy who's now a countercurrents reader who actually voted for Hillary Clinton in the last election.
Wow.
Right. I mean, that's pretty fast, right? It makes my head spin to see how fast these people can change the course in their lives. But there are a lot of people changing course from the left, and there are people on the right who are changing course. And one of the ways that people are changing course on the right is that they're just not beholden to the shibboleths, not shibboleths, but the dogmas, I guess, of free market economics. It is sort of a shibboleth in a way. It's like a touchstone that they erect. Everything's got to be free market, you know?
Sides kind of need to make like small steps. So if you look at like Breitbart They have a lot of mainstream conservative baggage, but they are making some like small steps in the right direction.
I agree.
With like some economic populism and a lot of articles against political correctness, like you could call that kind of the alt-right. And then the left can do the same thing, like the alt-left people can sort of move away from political correctness. So obviously, I mean, you can't expect everyone to kind of embrace like everything on countercurrents, but I think it's good to see the Overton window kind of move in these currents and see both sides kind of see the left move away from political correctness and open borders, and see the right kind of move away from a lot of that like free market capitalist mainstream conservative baggage.
Right, and one of the things that I think is most ludicrous is the right wingers who are so reactionary that they want to die on the hill of defending giant sodas full of corn syrup or unhealthy diets, right? Just because they don't like these namby-pamby liberals who want people to have a healthier lifestyle. And my attitude is, guys, that's the wrong hill to die on. Right. We there are far more important things than that. But I remember people like Sarah Palin, and then, years and years ago, like decades ago, Rush Limbaugh would be just reliably triggered by any kind of health crusade. And I think that kind of stuff on the right is slowly fading away as people become reoriented towards race and populist issues, because that just
a poll of Trump supporters, and this doesn't reflect Trump himself, but they found, even though they may be the most right wing on immigration, on tax cuts for the rich, and like on healthcare, they're actually to the left of the Republicans who supported the other candidates. And these are the rank and file Trump voters.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. I think Trump is, for once, offering Americans what they really want, which is a somewhat socially conservative, politically realistic populism that's willing to use government intervention into the economy and a sort of socially conservative center-left welfare state to better the lives of working and middle-class people. I think that is what we want. We want those kinds of populist policies, and we're never given them straight up. The Republicans always want to combine nods to social conservatism and a certain amount of political realism, or at least they used to in foreign policy, with this very corrosive free market ideology, which of course is also open borders ideology. And their political realism has been, was really sidelined for a long time by the neocons, which got us into these catastrophic wars and interventions in the past couple of decades. But and then, of course, the left, the Democrats will talk about protectionism during the campaigns. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama talked about protectionism. But of course, they were all for globalization, right? They would talk the talk, but they wouldn't actually put those policies in place. And so, and their real interest is more aligned with anti-white identity politics and just cultural decadence.
I've seen with the alt-left that kind of mirrors the alt-right. So in the alt-right, you have one faction of the alt-right, which is basically white nationalism. And then the other faction of the alt-right, which some might describe as the alt-light, which is like civic nationalism, opposition to political correctness. And there's people who are in the alt-right kind of like for the troll culture. They like the kind of freedom to say whatever you want. And the alt-left is a very small movement, but it's sort of rapidly emerging. It's really active on Facebook for the most part, but there's a number of different blogs. Like there's Robert Lindsay's blog, there's Rabbit's alt-left blog, there's Ryan England's Samist Chronicles, there's the YouTuber Prince of Queens. And you have one faction of the alt-left, which is kind of like the left wing of the alt-right, which is how Rabbit describes his blog. And that's closer kind of to your article.
I would also say I'm kind of alt-left too, but maybe that's something that's going about in the air.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of close. I was going to say it's kind of close to Greg's article, original article, West Coast White Nationalism. But then you also have people who are kind of like I would say they would be kind of like 60s liberals. They are anti-racist or non-racist. They support like a moderate degree of feminism, but at the same time they find like the really extreme SJW culture to be really obnoxious, and they're more moderate. So I see both movements having these two different wings.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Speaking of which, especially about how the left and the right, they're changing values and they're having different opinions which wouldn't be considered the classical left wing, right wing. I think this has a lot to do, I think you said before, about shaming and standards, that there's a certain, a healthy standard everyone should follow, and then you should shame those who are having like the anti-white agenda, and that seems to be working really well. It seems to me that the right has been able to like get rid of the whole conservative meme out of there, but able to like shame those that are like that. And there's this new standard where it's like the Trump advocate is now like the new Republican. And it's almost like the GOP is now like, it's coming to be like this white populist party, the civic nationalist party. But at the same time, I think there's this new standard being about. I think with the whole alt-left, there's also this new standard being about where they don't want to be this new left Derrida Foucault thing, or like they're trying to change or at least get the values on that.
That's interesting. I'd like to know more about that. I do think that within the Republicans and within the right, that the conservatives really are on the back foot. The energy and the drive and the intelligence and the idealism and the righteousness are all on the side of Trumpian populist types. And I think that's a great spectacle to behold. So I'm very, very excited by that. And I'd be interested to see how that dynamic might be playing out with people on the left too.
Pilleater, what were you going to say?
I was going to say it's interesting.
Do you want to ask about him, or do you think that's too lowbrow?
Oh, okay. Well, there's a bully that goes after Robert and me, and I know this is discuss petty drama. His name is Laguna Beach Fogey, and supposedly in this one interview, Greg, you said that he's a jerk because he was calling you some kind of shaming, but you said, damn right I'm shaming, and putting up that standard. So, I guess people will be people, but...
Oh, yeah. One of the things that I really don't like about the sort of MGTOW game community, right, is the anti-SJW types, the Gamergator types, is they basically seem to embrace a kind of nihilism as their default position. It's kind of default nihilism. And so anybody who has any standards is like their enemy.
Oh, yeah.
They're like an SJW. You're like an SJW. And that basically boils down to you have standards, you take things seriously, you don't think that certain people measure up, and you're going to try and shame them or purge them or
this has a lot to do
whip them into shape, bully them, however. Yeah.
This has a lot to do with your recent article about doxing on countercurrents. And I think this is very helpful because in an age where there's 4chan and the whole army's now on like Twitter trolls, where if you say an opinion that they just do not like, you're going to be doxxed if you get your face out there or say that you live in this major city. Someone will connect the dots and find where you are. And I feel as though that if people really dislike you, someone's going to try to dox you, but it also happens within the scene. And I haven't been paying much attention of some of the drama online, but, there can be a doxing happening within the alt-right or even the white nationalist scene, which I think is kind of scary because you wouldn't want your friend or somebody you trust to dox you.
Right, and you can't recommend a movement to people. You can't recommend that people get involved with white nationalism if there is a culture that turns a blind eye to doxing within the movement as a way of settling really petty scores, that is a totally dysfunctional environment. And we want to create an environment that is as welcoming as possible. And this thing is growing, guys. This thing is growing by leaps and bounds. I don't know what your stats look like with your podcast, but at Countercurrents, things have been getting bigger and bigger. And
you just took out a commercial from Big Man Tyrone, and that's been getting both of us a lot of publicity.
It's been 24 hours and 4,000 views.
Wow. Well, this thing is growing tremendously. It is growing by leaps and bounds, and that means that there are a lot of new people coming in. Now, there was a time when I was new to this, there was a time when you were new to this, and there was a time when all these fire-breathing radicals were new to this. And I just want everybody to think about what it was like when they were new to this scene. There was a time when every one of us had to sort of screw up his courage a bit just to look at a website and just to read heretical ideas in the privacy of our own bedrooms or offices, right? There was a time when we were all going through that. And because our movement is growing, there are a lot of people coming to us who are going through that. And we have to be somewhat sympathetic to that fact. We have to recognize that people are trying to get comfortable in this, and we want to create an environment that is as welcoming as possible because we want this thing to grow. And an environment that is filled with horrible drama and doxing and bullying and just really ugly behavior, purity spiraling, polarization, people who are, calling you names and shitting all over you and threatening you because, well, you aren't quite where they are. Even though they were where you were, even though they were where you are today, not so long ago themselves. It's just an ugly spectacle. It's an unwelcoming spectacle, and it is going to doom us to being marginal. And that's what we have to deal with. And so the doxing thing I put out was I just had an enough is enough moment. We have to come down on this really, really hard and draw the line because we want this thing to grow. And we need to come up with a set of rules and attitudes that will allow this movement to grow and have influence. And one of the things that I've always held is that it is important for us to have lines of communication, overlapping networks of influence with other people who have differing views who are closer to the mainstream. That's how you gain traction in this world. That's how you gain influence. Most real politics and most real business does not take place online. It takes place in the real world, and it doesn't take place over the phone. It takes place in person. This is why, even though New York City has just horrible weather most of the year, and it's just an awful place to live, so many people choose to live there because it has so many movers and shakers there. You can make things happen. You can get the 5 top people in a certain business together in New York City over dinner and make things happen. And there are other places like that in the country where you can do that in smaller areas like, Silicon Valley or the movie industry in Southern California. But even those people depend on what happens in New York. And Washington is not as powerful as New York, right? You don't have as many movers and shakers in Washington, actually, even when Congress is in session. But yeah, you have to have networks of real people that overlap with other groups and that extend your sphere of influence throughout society. Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, talks about connectors. And he says that connectors are people who have a lot of superficial relationships, and that these superficial relationships with a lot of different people extend across a lot of different social milieus and networks. And we need people like that. We need connectors. And we have polarizers. The classic example of this is Alex Linder of VNN, who's sort of like a fossil now. He's completely embittered and irrelevant, and I don't even know if he writes anything anymore. I think he tweets, but he's an odd character. But his attitude was always that anybody who is closer to the mainstream than him needs to be relentlessly attacked and bullied. And somehow he thinks that means that people will choose his side.
Yeah, that's absurd. It's kind of like that kind of old game, like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Like your objective is to be like the 6 degrees from you to like the establishment. And I mean, I've achieved that. I think I've achieved that myself. But if you have a degree of separation to people in the mainstream, that gives you a degree of legitimacy. You're connected to the culture. And a lot of these people, like the ones you mentioned, like Linder, they just want to like isolate themselves. It's like the equivalent of going out into the mountains and like so it's like the equivalent of going out and like being a hermit or like forming your own little like a clubhouse, not interacting with the world.
Yeah, and he thinks that by attacking people and bullying people, that he will force people to choose his side. Well, no, there's another option between being a mainstreamer and being a Linderite, and there's a whole world of options, and they go there. Only people who are really psychologically weak actually respond in a positive way to bullying. And I don't want psychologically weak people. He can have them. In fact, he's got a whole forum full of them at VNN. So, but that Linderite mentality is around, and people have this idea that by polarizing and bullying and attacking people who are 6 months behind them in their own ideological development is somehow going to make our movement grow and make it stronger, when it just makes things weaker and dumber and more marginal.
This has a lot to do with young people too. I mean, like there's a lot of young people like in their teenage who just found out about internet memes and jokes, and it seems to me like a high school mentality. And I started reading Countercurrents when I was 17 in like high school. So, I'm pretty sure there are other kids just like me who feel the same way. And then when they get into their like later 20s, or if they're married, do they still have this attitude? Is there a sense of maturity, or is it just pretty much young people and kooks?
Yeah, well, there are people who are growing up and growing by leaps and bounds, and there are a lot of people that I met. I think the youngest I know, somebody starting reading Countercurrents was 13. Yeah, I hate to say it, but I'm successfully corrupting the minds of the youth.
Especially remarkable is if they discover it on their own. Like there are parents who like push their politics on their kids.
Yeah.
But say maybe their parents disagree and they develop their own views. I mean, that is remarkable.
That's so true.
Yeah. Well, it's happening. There are people who started reading Countercurrents when 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and we've been on the air now online for 6.5 years. Yeah, that's a very important time for people's intellectual and emotional development. Yeah, I think a lot of the immature attitudes just are due to the fact that people involved in this aren't fully mature yet. I'm trying to help people negotiate their way to a more mature appreciation of how this movement works. And I think that the best thing that we can do is learn how to interact with and benefit from this great wave of people who are coming towards us but aren't fully there yet. And, attacking them as cucks and alt-light people and controlled opposition and all this other kind of stuff isn't the way to go. And so I would like to create a better culture that is more welcoming, because ultimately, we want to be, I'm never going to sit down with President Trump, right? But I wouldn't mind being 2 degrees of separation from him, through a lot of different routes. And I've managed that. I've actually managed that. I actually know people who know him now. I'm not going to mention any names, but the fact of the matter is,
if you go publicly, like Ann Coulter has connections to people in his campaign, and Ann Coulter is connected to like Pilleater and their places. So
yeah. And here's the thing, and this is something I learned, interestingly enough, from that very PC movie Milk, about Harvey Milk, that stars Sean Penn. It came out a few years ago and predictably got all kinds of awards because it was about a gay rights advocate. Anyway, one of the things that Milk did in the late 70s is he was part of the campaign against Proposition 8, which was a campaign, it was a ballot initiative funded by the religious right and championed by Anita Bryant to basically fire homosexual school teachers in the state of California. And the people who fought that believed that California voters would not vote for Proposition 8 if they knew a gay person, or at least knew somebody who knew a gay person. And so the assumption is that as long as they are an invisible minority, their enemies can basically paint an image of them. Right. Whereas if they're more visible, they can create their own public image, and that will fight that. Of course, all of this is thrown out the window with your average gay pride parade, which always seems to, put forward the worst possible image. But still, they had this idea that if people became more visible, ordinary people, not, parade float faggotry, but just ordinary nice people who have a house and a garden and a dog and so forth, and they happen to be gay. If these people are more visible, and somebody knows them or knows somebody who knows them, they are not going to persecute them. And I thought that is a very valuable principle that applies to our movement too. As long as we are invisible, the enemy, the media, can trot out their pictures of, skinheads and Sieg Heiling and people in Klan robes and stuff like that, and it sticks. But if we become more visible, more connected with people, so everybody in America either knows one of us or knows somebody who knows one of us, or maybe there's 3 degrees of separation, suddenly it is not so it's not so easy to stereotype us, stigmatize us, and persecute us. And that's what I want. I want us to be maximally connected and networked into the community, and as many of us to be visible as possible. If we're not public advocates, at least we're known in our circles of friends, right? And that's going to make it more and more difficult for the system to harm us, and it's going to make it easier and easier for us to persuade people that we have good ideas and that maybe we should be listened to. That's the future of this movement.
I think one trend you see a lot of a rise of political dissidents online, and you see parallels with the Bernie Sanders movement as well, is you have a lot of intelligent people from like well-educated backgrounds. Maybe their parents are part of the upper middle class, and they're struggling economically. And the thing is, that also means people who maybe would have been successful 20 to 30 years ago, they would have been busy making money and had no time to think about other things. But you have all these like really intelligent people with a lot of time on their hands online to kind of discover new ideas and like brainstorm. And there's a lot of reading a lot of new like political dissidents.
I think that the middle classes and upper classes and really college students who sort of have an ideally leisurely lifestyle are the people who are most red pillable in a way. Because
they opposed to kind of stereotype like of the redneck and like the trailer park voting for Trump.
Well, and the reason why I think that is that, and I'm not a snob, a political snob. I'm a political populist. I do think that a political system has to represent the interests of everybody in it. And that means though, that that doesn't imply, though, that just everybody is equally likely to contribute to, a political movement that's going to gain power. There are people who are disproportionately better educated, more well organized. They have fewer problems with their families. They have fewer personal problems. They have fewer addictions and things like that. You want to find people like that. You want to find people who have a little bit of money in the bank and earning potential. They can just contribute more. And so I tend to think that what we need to do is pitch our message to intelligent people who are in college and intelligent people who are middle or upper class, because these things are correlated with power, basically. People who go to college are more powerful than people who don't, politically speaking, and in terms of their connections and their influence on society. People who have money have more influence than people who don't have money. If you're running an organization, it's always better to have people who are less likely to burn out or flake out because they got some kind of drug problem or white trash drama, right? And when you look at our movement, there's so much of what I just call white trash drama, where you get people with no manners, just uncivilized people just slogging it out online. And it's truly vicious stuff. And we don't want to create that kind of madhouse Jerry Springer show atmosphere.
I remember a while back you said you were an economic populist and a cultural elitist.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable. One of the things that interested me recently, it was a very enjoyable experience, was I reread I rewatched a documentary called Arguing the World, and I wrote a review of it. It's called What the Neocons Got Right. And it's about the neoconservative movement, and it focuses on Irving Kristol, Daniel Bell, Nathan Glazer, and Irving Howe. And Howe went from being a Trotskyite to a democratic socialist, but the other three became neocons, basically. Just one sec. Daniel Bell described himself in there as a cultural elitist, and basically he said he's a socialist in politics, or a socialist in economics, a Democrat in politics, and an elitist in culture, or like a conservative elitist in culture. And I thought, yeah, that's a reasonable position. And that had made an impression on me years ago when I first watched it. And yeah, I would describe myself as kind of a populist in terms of politics, and an elitist in terms of culture, but also in terms of political institutions. Because if you want a society to reliably represent the interests of everyone, you can set things up in such a way that is more likely to happen. But you're still going to want people who are better than average in political office. You're going to want an elite, a political elite, that is organically connected with the whole population and serves the common good.
What kind of personality traits do you think capitalism rewards for selecting for an elite? And do you think those are the wrong traits to select?
Well, I am not... I've created a small business, basically, with countercurrents. And it's really hard. I'm not really good at it. It's been going, I started it during a terrible economic recession, and it's been going 6.5 years, and it's been growing. So that makes me a very rare person. The ability to create a small business is really rare, and I'm not even very good at it. So the people who are able to create a small business and are good at it, and the people who are able to create a large business and are good at that, those are very rare people. And it's important to value the traits that allow that to happen. So I do admire business entrepreneurs, business creators, they have rare traits that I think can work to the benefit of all of society. But there is also a tendency, I think, in business to reward people for being rootless and sociopathic.
Yeah, there's different types of people. There's like entrepreneurs and innovators and inventors. And then there's also people who kind of like are able to move their way up the corporate ladder. And I remember a while back, you on a previous podcast, like you said you would put a cap on income at like 100 million, but you'd make an exception for inventors.
Yeah, I just threw that out there. Here's the thing. There is a tendency, I think, in capitalism to be global, right? Goods and services, if they're allowed to flow back and forth over borders, capital, if they're allowed to flow back and forth over borders, there will be a global market. And unfortunately, economic globalization is really, really bad for people who are, in the first world, where we've had a great deal of social and economic progress under conditions of protectionism. And when you eliminate protectionism, and protectionism really was the default position for a very, very long time, and it still exists in many subtle ways, you will find the creation of a global labor market, which means that global wages will fall in the first world by a lot and rise by a little bit in the third world until we have parity in various industries. That's just the way it's going to happen. And that's really, really bad.
The way things kind of started out is originally it was like the working class people in the Rust Belt who got the shaft. But eventually it's going to get to the point where you even see it affecting the kids of the upper middle class. So we'll like reach the same level as the third world. And really, I mean, some people in the third world, there might be minimal benefits, but it's really like the global 1% that are the true benefactors.
Well, yeah, because there's this long period of time where basically when the first world still exists as a place of relative wealth, people can charge first world prices for things made in the third world and reap enormous profits, right? But of course, after a while, as that process continues, there are going to be fewer and fewer people with first world incomes and standards of living. And so it's going to be very destructive in the long run of a lot of things that we call progress and a lot of things that the left has called progress, like rising wages and safety regulations and environmental regulations. Things like that are all going to start disappearing with economic globalization. And I think that's really, really important.
That's also cultural, right? Like here. There in college, it seems to me that there is more of this acceptability about accepting new ideals, or the red pilling, where you can get them to believe this and that. And about economics, where it seems to me where, like you just said, if there was this whole economic thing, you would stop on certain liberties that the left have. Is that right? Or am I getting...
Well, I think the left has created a lot of progress in the West in essentially tight labor markets, right?
Yeah.
And by tightening up labor markets, wages have risen, and we have arrived at the Western middle class and the Western working class. And that is being undone by offshoring businesses and importing people by opening up borders. And so there, if you can assert national priorities in the economic realm and just make it impossible for business people to get any advantage out of being rootless and sociopathic, lacking in connection to their people, then business works really well. And so you just have to impose good selection mechanisms and prevent bad selection mechanisms.
Okay.
And once you do that, I think the real talents of people in the business world are enormously valuable, and they should be appreciated.
We talked about this with the podcast with Barry Guy and the FIRE economy. Instead of just sort of punishing wealth or success, it makes more sense to sort of shift the tax burden. There's a sort of concept of the FIRE economy, which stands for finance, insurance, rent, and it makes more sense to shift the burden of the economy to sort of economic parasitism instead of productive economics, like a Tobin tax on financial speculation, tax on outsourcing, instead of just punishing, instead of just like taxing wealth and punishing success.
Yeah, exactly. I love economic innovators, right, and inventors, people who just make money by financial speculation and rents and things like that are a different class of people, and they should not be encouraged as much as people who are genuinely creating new things. I believe in economic protectionism. I think that we should guard manufacturing jobs. We should want to be somewhat autarkic in vast areas of manufacturing. And we should just impose tariffs on imports. And if we lower those tariffs, they should only be with countries that have comparable standards of living for their workers.
Like, I just want to butt in. It just reminds me about how this is like, it seems to me that this will definitely work if you have people who have similar interests to one another. And just on the college campus area, I'm going to tell a little story here. For some time, I was in the PSL, the Party of Social and Liberation. It sounds like geeky, but the ideal was this. It's basically you're on campus, and then there's a bunch of kids eating food. And you go up to them and they, hey, you want to play nappy sack or kick or they throw the ball around, they kick the ball, and it's fun. And then they talk to you real nice. Oh, do you have any social problems? What do you mean social problems? Well, maybe it might be true that socialism works. And it becomes this kind of Christian thing, right? I've been in a couple of Christian clubs myself, but it's this method where you say, I'm like you like me, we have similar interests. But the output or the ideology seems to be different, right? And it seems to me that if you were to get a white nationalist or white racial advocacy happen, you have to make people believe that there is this trust or high standards. And it reminds me of something where this argument or something is going, where if business is to be saved, you got to make people believe that this is the right way and uphold the standards. Is that right? Or
mm-hmm. Yeah, we really have to bend all of our minds to the larger problem here, which is how to make the character of the people who are representing the movement as good as the ideas that they're representing. Because I think the ideas that we represent are true, and they're good for the world. The world's perishing from the lack of these ideas. And it would be nice to get to a situation where the people who advocate these ideas are as high-minded as the ideas themselves, that we are as compassionate and approachable and admirable as people who are, say, doing missionary work. I said this after the Dylan Roof shooting, where I looked on him and I thought, this kid was bright. He had a terrible sort of upbringing and education, but he was naturally bright. And isn't it a shame that he couldn't look around in his community and find people who advocate for our ideas that are as wholesome as the Mormons or some other group like that? Mormons are really good at selling their ideas, and one of the ways that they sell them is by putting their missionaries out there and trying to pick people who are really, really wholesome and who can relate to you well. And I think
individuals, like you mentioned, like Dylan Roof, those kind of people are very black pill, And I think what it is you get individuals are completely, the problem is they're not part of a healthy community. They're completely like atomized and alienated from society, and they go into that like a deep nihilism.
Yeah, I agree. And wouldn't it be nice if we had a community that is as welcoming and affirming and white pilling as a lot of church groups strive to be? That's how we really need to think of the progress of this in the future. We want this to be a wholesome and welcoming community, not something that seems like a bunch of weasels tied up together in a bag.
I have to agree. I mean, like right now, how I found out about crowd currents was just my own youthful way of doing it. It's the same way how, they would tell me about socialism. And like, the funny part is I'm in Philadelphia and I actually got to see Camille Paglia and shake her hands or something. And that led me to more other things, that's related back on. But it's also true that, all this stuff is being exposed at once to the innocence of youth, where it becomes convoluted in a sense. And I think what's happening, especially in these like liberal cities where, they have a lot of money and do what they want, they're kind of creating these countercultures that are not going with the, like I said right now, that the white standard is so like corrupt and messed up, with you have like white feminists and all. So one thing Robert was teasing me on, and I've been trying to experiment this with myself. I've been joking with this.
You're saving it for the very end of the show.
Do you want me to talk to it right now? I'll say it.
Go ahead.
Well, the thing is, I've been joking with this term, saying, look, the standards right now, it seems to me that from what I know, and all the other white liberal friends I know, they're all dating Asian girls, right? I mean, this is kind of a self-related story. And then when they date their Asian girls, they're kind of like, not only that they're race mixing, but they're taking pride in their white identity, but somehow juggling with the Asian and Chinese side. I'm like, okay, if I even know one friend who loves alt-right stuff, and he's almost going to get married to this one Chinese girl, and it's going to become what I call a quote-unquote Asian-Aryan society, that if these trends keep continuing, I know it sounds like science fiction, but the thing is, if these trends keep continuing, it seems to me this liberal society is going to like morph into this strange, Tila Tequila or Margaret show, where it's this like Asian American or like whites having their cuck nature, but like still liking and reading like alt-right stuff. And I just don't know how do you answer that Asian question, or like whites just like, I know it's a good reason of the whole men are going their old way, but it's kind of nihilistic. But at the same time, they're only choosing Asian women is simply because they can't stand their white feminists. And it seems to me white girls there has to be this Christian faith, or, not them, or this new faith that it means something. And, what is there to do about that?
Wow, that's a topic for a whole other podcast. But it is a really good question. There are people that I know who are married to and have families with non-whites, Asians primarily, and yet they are red-pilled people who are largely on board with the kind of things that we're doing.
It's interesting to point out is the people who are quote-unquote red pill, it's usually with Asians as opposed to other groups. I mean, people with other groups are more likely...
I have a video on my YouTube channel. I just recently uploaded it, where I interviewed this girl from Malaysia, and she's telling me that she went with her white boyfriend simply because she loves white culture, and she imagines that there's going to be this new race of, I'm going to use my term, Asian-Aryan, where it's like you can still have this white identity, white nationalist thing, and yet your girlfriend's Asian. I find that really confusing, and I'm trying to wrap my head around it. Mainly because, I'm going to be honest, I was in Asian studies for 2 years of my life, though I graduated with English and communications. But still, it's a concerning interest where this is going and what this future of multicultural diversity means and why this effect, how can you rewind it or reverse it?
Well, you can't rewind it when the genes get scrambled, and that's one of the things that makes me worried about this. My feeling about this is the following. I totally understand why people like Asians. Okay, I totally understand why they like Asian culture. I especially like Japanese culture, but all the Asian cultures are fairly interesting.
Did you
Japan,
mention
China.
you lived in an Asian community at one point?
Well, I lived around a lot of Asians, but oddly enough, that actually wasn't a very pleasant experience because they mostly just ignored me, right? Yeah. It was...
yeah, it's true. I can understand, too. Just being around
Yeah.
Japanese, they'll be like, you're not honorable because, one, you're non-Japanese, and you have to prove you're Japanese. The thing is, you're white, and it's just like, you're going to have white identity. And it's just
Right.
weird. But at the same time...
A lot of people are attracted to these cultures because they are integral cultures. They are not multicultural. They take pride in their civilization. They look down upon foreigners, and we instinctively want that, but we can't get that from their culture, right? And so we have to get it for ourselves from our civilization. The other thing, of course, is that Asian women tend to be more agreeable than white women. Who even Asian feminist women tend to be more agreeable than white feminist women.
Have you ever heard of yellow feminism before? It's this ideal.
Well, yeah. Go ahead.
Yellow feminism is this ideal that if you put feminism for Asian women, they don't go against universal patriarchy. They go against Asian patriarchy, creating their
interest. They attracted to white men.
Yes.
Yeah. There is that tendency. Years ago, Philippe Rushton, who was doing research on this, told this to me. I don't know if he ever published his research, but he's dead now. But he told me that actually the profile of Asian women who are attracted to white men is that they tend to be feminist and so forth. And so I thought that was interesting, an interesting finding, and it makes sense because they're rebelling against their own group, obviously, and you have to understand.
That kind of reminds me. I think Steve Saylor wrote an article pointing out that like black conservatives were darker than black liberals, and black liberals were lighter and more mixed. And I think the conclusion was that people who are more like traditional and rooted are more likely to be in their stick with their own group.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So, in a way, it's not a solution. I understand why it happens. I understand why people take up with Asians, because they're more agreeable. The females are more agreeable than your average white woman, just because white women are so addled by feminism. And two, they're intelligent people who have a civilization, and they also like our civilization a lot. In fact, the more I know particular Asians, the more I realize a lot of them, the ones who are most interested in our civilization, have a huge inferiority complex about their civilization. We look upon their civilization and we like it. We think, wow, this is impressive. We like the fact that it's so of a single style. Korea is very Korean. You can't mistake it for China or Japan. It's got a unique style that you see imprinted everywhere. The Koreans who really like America have a real inferiority complex about their civilization, oddly enough. Wouldn't
it be healthier for them to have their own national identity? Like there's Korean nationalists who want to kick out the American military, and that's completely rational.
Yeah, I would like that. I would like all the different peoples of the world to have a healthy nationalism and a healthy pride in themselves, and also healthy gender identities and sexual relations, and so without miscegenation. And so basically, we would admire the Japanese from a distance, and they'd admire us from a distance. And yet it would only go so far, because there would be this recognition that we can never be Japanese and they can never be us. But B, we'd get over these hang-ups that we have, their inferiority complexes, our self-hatred, right? That would make us want to gravitate towards another civilization, right? I think that so many of the factors that drive miscegenation and drive also sort of cultural appropriation between whites and Asians are really they're negative and unhealthy factors. Feminism, self-hatred, feeling like they're part of a civilization that's in decline and so forth. And so I think that if we get our civilization back on the right track and we reestablish healthy, biologically normative relations between the sexes and things like that in both Asia and in the West, that we'll find that there'll be less temptation to mix, and there'll also be greater, I think, a healthier appreciation of one another's civilizations. That's what I hope.
It also seems true that for the people who are racially mixed or half Asian or half white, they seem to, if they are a part of that white culture, I mean, you might be considered, I met a person who basically had, she had a Chinese mom and yet she considered herself white, even though the genes were still there, even though there's that some kind of racial mix or identity, it still means that it's like, yeah, I can understand where it's like one healthy race, you kind of gravitate toward that. And then it's almost like you don't want to be on the other side. And it's more like two healthy parents make a healthy child. And it seems
Pilleater, one of the things you've been advocating is like there can be two different countries, and carve up the country, and then let each own little nation decide their own values.
Yeah, you give all the HAPA people and like the already what has happened today, give them the size of like Delaware or Rhode Island, and just call it a little Vatican City where it's like.
Well, I guess Hawaii's kind of that way already.
Oh yeah, Hawaii or some parts of California. I mean, I've never been to California, but I've heard it's nothing but white male, Asian female, Asian male, white female.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in LA recently, that's like all you saw.
Yeah, it's still statistically not the majority, oddly enough, but you see more of it. It's one of those things that you will. It makes a strong impression on you. Over and above the actual numerical strength of it, interestingly enough. It's like with blacks, whites will immediately whites will think there are a whole lot of black people around when there might only be like 10 or 12, right? Yeah. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, a lot, right? We tend to focus in on these sorts of things, and then because we focus on them, we get a false impression that there are more of them than there actually are, that it's more of a thing.
The reason why I would be concerned is simply because I believe, and from statistics from American Renaissance and pages I saved, it seems to me that in the multicultural society that white men just don't choose black wives or Mexican wives or something. They always seemingly choose Asian. I guess this is probably something I learned in undergrad school, but it's this ideal where it seems to be this strange bias where it's like, given the chance of multiculturalism, whites will choose stuff white people like. I mean, even in Christian Lander's book, he even said that they're the model minority, and like you will choose them over anyone else, and they will not consider any other option. And it's like I have to agree on that.
Well, even though it seems actual statistics for marriages. Actually, I think Hispanic is much more common in Asian, but that's because
I think it's because they're more white looking. I would imagine Hispanic.
Well, not so much in California.
That is interesting. One of the things that I did some research on this years ago, and I'm sure there's better data on it now, but Asian men and black women are the great losers in the interracial dating world. And it's really, really true. But that is predictable just in terms of like serum testosterone levels, right? Men with less testosterone are going to get less sex and do worse in the interracial dating game than men with more.
What about men who are Eurasian?
Yeah, I think men who are Eurasian tend to. I think they would probably be sort of an average of Asians and whites, and therefore they would probably do less well than whites or blacks in the interracial dating game. Whereas black women have a lot of testosterone. And that makes them less attractive that and of course, there's a whole factor of looks. There are typical looks that people have too, and black looks are less attractive on the average. But if but even that is overcome by the hormone issue. So this is one of the reasons why I think that we have to really reinstitute bans and barriers to miscegenation, and that's really what nationalism is, in a sense. It's just saying, look, we live in a homogeneous society, and your choices are constrained by that. You don't need miscegenation laws if you live in a 100% white society, right? Yeah, your immigration laws are de facto anti-miscegenation laws. But when you have multicultural societies, multiracial societies, then there's a need for these kinds of explicit or just sort of and legal or merely cultural barriers to gene mixing.
Because we were joking about this on the other day. Pilleater, do you remember that comment Greg made on that podcast about
Yeah, it was about the Elliot Rodgers incident when that happened. And I know, Robert, you tamed the focus on the whole blonde Jewish part. I was just going over it again. Do you remember about it? It was about Elliot Rodger and how there was...
Greg said something about his observations on...
a blonde... Like how in California there's a lot of Jews women that will try to pretend to look like white women. We were talking about this too.
No, they're natural. They're natural blondes, but we were talking about that on our podcast about LA we just did.
Like Jews will pretend and look like blonde women, even though that's kind of funny because what they're really attracting is white men, and they think that they're emulating the behavior of what white men want. Something like that, right?
No, but I was talking about like natural. I think natural blondes is what I was referring to.
Okay.
Greg, you remember that podcast with Colin Liddell?
I honestly don't. I've gotten to the point where I've given too many interviews, and people say to me things. I really like something you said, and I just sort of blink. It's did I say that? Yeah. I'd like to write that down.
But it all makes sense.
So I can say it again.
Like we were just talking, it all makes relevant sense. No, I was just saying, like earlier we were talking because I was looking at this one Stark Truth interview. I'll upload it on my YouTube. But
I kind of do have like this photographic memory of like everything I've said on the show, pretty much.
But yeah, Greg said, "Oh yeah, I would permit abortion if it was a mixed race child." Now that sounds like a super Hollywood neo-Nazi, but it's like it makes healthy sense that like in a healthy the child might not survive, or it might not. Let's be science fiction and fantasy here. It's not like we're promoting like kill all innocent babies. It's more like it would be bad for the greater good of society, and it's like being raped and then having a kid or something, and it's not your kid, it's the rapist's kid or something like that. I don't know. That's how I'm translating as.
Well, I just think that it's important to maintain boundaries against miscegenation and racial purity, and if somebody goes off to Jamaica and comes home with a half-black child gestating in her womb, and she's coming back to a white society, I would just say, look, either go back to Jamaica or get an abortion.
It's usually, as you were saying before, it's usually with Asia because Asia is more advanced. Jamaica is a more primitive society.
Well, but white women go for black guys sometimes, and it's just true. It's the white women with black eyes and white men with Asian chicks thing that we see more often. But a lot of times though, a lot of mixed race children, especially half black children, are conceived by rape. Okay, and I mean this happens a lot, and this is why abortion rates. Racial abortion statistics are actually hard to come by because we know the race of the mother, right? But we don't necessarily know the race of the child, and so
the same case could be said for birth rate statistics as well.
Well, when the child is actually born, you know what race it is and what race the father is, but there are white women who go in and have abortions, and let's say white women have 40% of abortions or whatever. That doesn't mean that that they're aborting white babies necessarily, because there are a lot of cases where they're aborting mixed race children, either because it was conceived out of in a rape situation, or was conceived in a relationship with somebody who's not going to stick around and help raise it. And
So
almost always
wouldn't
that's
make
a black.
That's the case you were making. Like some people who are maybe they know a friend, a couple who are in like a loving relationship and they have a child, and they might get really offended by that. But you were mainly referring to a situation like that.
Well, yeah. I mean, honestly, if people want to have interracial relationships and they're in loving relationships, they just need to go outside of a white white ethno-state, right, to do that. But yeah, I mean, I would support basically if you have a situation where you have all white society, you obviously don't want to change that, and so I would say. You would either, if somebody comes home with a mixed race child, you'd either say, go back to where you got the child, or have an abortion, or put it up for adoption outside the country, right? But we don't want we don't want that gene drift, and of course, it's very, very easy to say, oh, it's my child, and well, I mean that's why miscegenation is so bad. Once you mix your genes, you mix your loyalties, right? Yeah. You'd be a monster. You'd be a monster not to love a child once it's born, and it's very hard. It's a monstrous thing to it's monstrous for women to have abortions, right? And it's monstrous, and it's hard on women to give up their children for adoption. It's really hard to do.
It seems like everybody in Black Lives Matter seems to be an offspring of a black dad and white mother, or even white father and black mother, and they seem to be half. Like, I've known everyone who's in Black Lives Matter, and it just seems to be a mixed race of like half white, half black. Do you think there's something in the political agenda where Black Lives Matter is pretty much an angry party of identity crisis, or like they're it's like the Malcolm X thing, you know? Or even for Obama's case, I mean, his dad was like somewhat abusive and just like dropped his children from. I mean, Obama even has a half brother who's like who has a Chinese wife. It's really strange.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the reasons why there's a tendency, I think in all black political movements, there's a tendency for mulattoes to run things, or part white people, just because on average they have higher IQs, right? But another thing though is that they also have identity crises.
Trend with like Mexican American activism, like you have people who are mostly indigenous, and they do the jobs at the very bottom of the society. Then you have people like, I think like the technical word is a harnizo, who are about like 60 to 70% Caucasian and 30 to 40% indigenous, and they form kind of like the most Caucasian element of the Mexican American population, and they make up the sort of political activists. So you see that same trend as well. Have you noticed that?
Yeah. I know. Another thing is, I think that mixed race people, they might be brighter, but they also have identity crises. And so they're more consciously concerned with blackness and black authenticity and stuff like that. And but also I do think that they're just rewarded for being activists, right? They see this as an upward mobility pathway, and so they are attracted to that.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that.
Okay, we're at the end of the show. Greg, do you want to talk about your plans for 2017?
Well, I've been actually thinking about this. We're going to write a piece about it. Really, my plans for 2017 are more of the same, but better, which is really my plan for every new year. It's just more of the same, but better. So Countercults is going to publish more books than we did last year, and we're going to keep the webzine going, high quality. We're going to have more interviews, more podcasts, I hope. One of the things that I'm going to do definitely more of is organize events, IRL, real world events. That's really important.
Would these be events open to the public or private events?
Mostly private events. I still think there's a greater value to private events because we don't want things to be closed down by protesters or infiltrated by journalists and Antifa types. We really want, again, a comfortable environment where people have a reasonable assurance of privacy and safety so they can be themselves. And I think that's the most valuable thing that we can do for people, is just provide them with real world fellowship where there is a certain amount of security. So I'm doing in 2017, I'm going to be organizing 6 events in the Pacific Northwest for the Northwest Forum, 6 events in New York for the New York Forum, and I'm going to be sort of subcontracting these things out to people in New York. I'm getting help. I have helpers there who are helping with these things, and I'm going to try and foster as many independent groups as possible, so I don't have to keep my eye on all this stuff all the time. I want to outsource these things, plant these things around the country. I'm also going to organize a Francis Parker Yockey Memorial Dinner in the summer, June or July, in San Francisco, and a few other little events. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm doing. And I'm going to be doing at least 13 events in 2017. 13 events in 2017, 6 of them in the Northwest, 6 of them in New York, 1 of them in San Francisco, and there might be a couple of things in late March that I will do, one in Philadelphia and 1 in Washington, D.C. But that's a little up in the air yet because of some other stuff that's coming up around that time. Another thing I'm going to be probably doing is in February, I'm going to be speaking in Tallinn, Estonia, and in Stockholm, Sweden.
Cool.
So I've got a lot of plans for
February?
speaking. February, yeah, late February. It's going to be cold. Going to have to bundle up.
Well, Greg, it's been a great show. Thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me, both of you guys. It's been a really enjoyable conversation, and let's do this again soon, okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Okay,
Bye.
Good night.
Good night, Greg.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.